Hello. So we are picking up now from where we left off with the sociological imagination, and today I want to talk about a concept that geographers and other social scientists refer to as the spatial imagination. I will variously talk about it as the spatial imagination, as geographical imagination, as spatial consciousness, and a few other related terms. Some of these concepts we will revisit later when we talk about theorists like David Harvey, Henri Lefebvre, Doreen Massey. But today I want to give us a sense of what it means to think about social relations and spatial relations together. What do I mean by space here? This is not the space that we often refer to in our common parlance as that which is up there in astronomy, for example, but this is the space that we inhabit. Space is that dimension of our life where we live in, and time, for example, as in relation to space, is that dimension of our life which we often see as progressing, as dynamic, as one after the other. So usually time is seen as something that has movement, that goes from one to the other, and in common parlance and for quite some time the social scientists were also plagued with this idea of seeing space largely as a backdrop, as something that is inert, as something that is static. That is the myth, or that is the idea that I want us to break today, so that through the lectures in social theory, I want you to keep the idea of space as dynamic, as space as multiplicity, and space as something that co-constructs the social in our lives. All right, so I want to read out once again from C. Wright Mills, and this is from his text that we talked about in our previous lecture on the sociological imagination. And pay attention to some of the words here, I will also highlight them. He writes, "The first fruit of this imagination is the idea that the individual can understand his own experience and gauge his own fate only by locating himself within his period, that he can know his own life chances in life by becoming aware of those of all individuals in his circumstances. The sociological imagination enables us to grasp history and biography and the relations between the two in society. Back of its use, there is always the urge to know the social and historical meaning of the individual in society and in the period in which he has his quality and his being." So there is a reference along with the social and the biographical of history, of historical time, of the period that the individual inhabits. However, there is a missing spatial element to this particular way of articulating the sociological imagination. Now, the term geographical imagination was first used by Hugh Prince in 1962 in a journal article that he published in J.B. Jackson's journal referred to as Landscape. It was a journal of human geography, and in this article, Prince basically asks us about the role of geography and the conundrum in geography to bring together what is the subjective, the interpretive, with one of the functions of geography, and that is explanation. And explanation, according to him, should not have an interpretive subjective aspect. So how does one in the practice of the discipline bring together the subjective with explanation? And this was the first time that geographical imagination is used in this way. Now I want us to go to David Harvey, and I will read out this quote. Like I said, we will eventually also read him as a theorist, but for today we will have to suffice with this one quote. He writes, and he also variously refers to the spatial imagination as spatial consciousness. He also uses the term geographical imagination as that which enables the individual to recognize the role of space and place in his own biography, to relate to the spaces he sees around him, and to recognize how transactions between individuals and between organizations are affected by the space that separates them. It allows him to recognize the relationship which exists between him and his neighborhood, his territory, or to use the language of street gangs, his turf. Pardon the use of his in both that the previous quote and this one, it's of its time, but it refers to humanity as a whole. It allows him to judge the relevance of events in other places, on other people's turf, to judge whether the march of communism in Vietnam, Thailand and Laos is or is not relevant to him wherever he is now. Now, Harvey is using examples from the 1970s, and he's talking about whether whatever is happening in Vietnam or Laos is relevant to an individual's life in Baltimore, that he's the space that he's inhabiting. I would urge us to think about how, for example, something happening around us in today's time impacts us. How does, let's say, the changing regulations of the trading in copper impact our life here? Or how does the building of a flyover between Delhi and Chandigarh impact our ability to access the eateries along the highway? You know, things like that. Very mundane examples, but very, very relevant in terms of trying to see how something that might appear as distant and something that might appear as unrelated actually has a deep relationship to the way we are able to lead our lives. Harvey writes, it allows him also to fashion and use space creatively and to appreciate the meaning of the spatial forms created by others. And we will come to some examples which will illustrate this much better as we move on. As a small aside, I want us to look at a few maps, and I am doing this because largely when we think of space in the geographic sense, and largely when we think of geography, what comes to our mind is maps. We all grew up with this idea, and a map is primarily a representation of the earth, an earth which is spherical, three-dimensional, translated onto a two-dimensional map. And there are several ways of doing this, right? So what I have up here for you is a Mercator projection, and in this projection what you see is North America and Western Europe as larger or equivalent as to South America and Africa, whereas they may not be that big. The map is also centered around Western Europe as opposed to, let's see, this map. Now this map actually really disorients us because we are used to looking at the other map so often with the north side up, and most often we don't really question why is it that it is always the north that is shown, as the map is always oriented in that direction. In this map, which is a South up Peters projection, you basically see somewhat more realistic sizes of the continents, and you get a sense of how large Africa truly is. I have yet another map to show you. This is an azimuthal projection, and this map basically alerts us to the fact that in our mapping we have mostly privileged land masses over the oceans, whereas the oceans actually occupy a large part of the Earth's surface, and oceans are also very significant in terms of how our histories and geographies have developed. So, and again, as yet another aside, I am showing you that this is the projection that we usually see on the UN logo. So, this is just a side, might be of interest to some of you. But the fact that I wanted to point us towards is that the way we conceptualize space or a spatial relationship, mapping being one example of that, is political and is intricately tied to social relations. In this sense, in the ones that we saw, to global social relations. I have something here, something more intimate. This is from my phone. I took a screenshot as I tried to look at the route from Aisar Mohali, where I live, to Sector 17, which is the center of the city of Chandigarh. It is the commercial center in the heart of the city. Now, while this might look like a very accurate description of this path, what this representation ends up doing is missing out on the lived, how that space is lived, what kind of social relations are made possible, and what kind of social relations are not made possible by this arrangement of the spaces. It also does not tell me much about who feels safe walking on those streets, who is welcome, who was perhaps dislocated to build those roads. So, a large amount of the lived aspect of space is missed out in such a representation. And what we mainly get is the relationship between measured space. So, we get a sense of distance, but distance here takes precedence over lived experience and social relations. This is something that is often seen in the work of architects and planners, and in fact it goes yet another step ahead, where architects and planners are trained to design spaces, mostly in this case that I am talking about are cities, and through that design there is a sense that somehow a new social order may emerge. I have given the example here of Chandigarh. Again, Aisar Mohali, where I work and live, is kind of adjacent to Chandigarh. So this is the city we inhabit. It's a city built in a grid plan, and the idea, it was built in the 1950s to resettle the populations displaced by the partition of Punjab. The French modernist architect Le Corbusier and his team were invited by the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru to build this space for a new, independent, emerging, hopeful, modern nation. So he said of, this is a famous quote that we will see often about Chandigarh, is let this be a new city unfettered by the traditions of the past, a step into the nation's future. So here the architect or the planner has a brief to create something that will create a new citizen for the modern Indian Republic, newly independent India. And so this is a very explicit example, but more often than not, we see that in examples of other cities, New Delhi being one example, but many others, in the way markets are designed, in the way plazas are designed, in the way malls are designed, that this idea that a new social order can be created through built space, but also the notion that some people can have access, whereas others may not feel comfortable in that space. Just wanted to put this out there to get you to think about this possible conceptualization of space. And we will go again deeper into this when we look at Lefebvre and Harvey's notions of perceived space, abstract space, lived space, and so on. When we talk about lived space, I want to bring to our attention the work of Kevin Lynch, his book The Image of the City from the 1960s, and here he did a study of residents in Massachusetts, in Boston, to see how is it that people understand the space that they inhabit. And he noted through his empirical study, he made people draw maps of how they commute from their home to their work and back, and what they remember from that journey. And he writes that people remember spaces in particular ways, and his image of the city gives us 5 different ways in the kind of artifacts of the city that hold that form the image of the city for the residents of the city. And these are path, people remember paths that they take, edges of districts, and districts, nodes, and landmark. And even in the case of Chandigarh, this becomes very apparent because the way sectors are positioned, the notion of the district becomes quite significant and visible. All right. Now I want to come to the use of the term imagined geographies, again to highlight that all of us hold images of space in our mind that construct who we are. And I'm getting to this idea that space constructs us, but we also construct space and an imagination of spaces inside our heads, and then that in turn again leads us to particular actions, particular notions, and discourses that surround us, representations that surround us have a huge role to play in the kinds of images or imaginations that become possible for us to hold within our mental frames. So I'm going to read out here a quote from Edward Said's book Orientalism, and he writes, "The objective space of a house, its corners, corridors, cellar, rooms, is far less important than what poetically it is endowed with, which is usually a quality with an imaginative or figurative value we can name and feel. Thus a house may be haunted or home-like, or prison-like or magical. So space acquires emotional, even rational sense by a kind of poetic process, whereby the vacant or anonymous reaches of distance are converted into meaning for us here." Remember in that Google Maps image that I showed, there was the notion of space in relation to distance. But what we are talking about here is the kind of meaning that space has and acquires for us. Now he is asking us to look at it in a much more political sense also, poetic and political. He writes, "For there is no doubt that imaginative geography and history help the mind to intensify its own sense of itself by dramatizing the distance and difference between what is close to it and what is far away from it." So what our conceptions of space does, and what the discourses that surround us does, is that we create an othering process through our conceptualizations of space. And he gives the example here of largely how the West ended up constructing the East as that which is opposite of the Occident. So the Orient which is savage, the Orient which is distant and unknown, unknowable, and several other stereotypes that go along with it. But here what I want to emphasize for us is that the idea that we all hold notions and imaginations of space which are largely unreflected upon. And as part of what we are calling the spatial imagination, we want ourselves, and as the process in this class unfolds, to pay attention to these notions that we hold about distant spaces, about our own spaces, about the othering in relation to space of those that are distant from us. Now, other scholars, especially a lot of feminist scholars, have also used the term geographical imaginary in the context that I am here writing about. This is Gillian Ross's work, and she talks about the geographical imaginary as the imaginary in the subject's whole creation of a world for itself. And what such an imaginary does is two kind of tasks. One is bordering, so it creates borders between that which is near and that which is far, the home and the world, us versus them, right? And it has certain imaginations for the us and other kinds of imaginations for them. And these imaginations are not kind of linear, they have an ordering, they have a hierarchical ordering in the sense that while the Occident, let's say in this example, is advanced, is civilized, and the Orient, which has a very different culture, which is not recognizable, then gets listed lower down in the hierarchy. So these kind of creations in our imagination is what these authors ask us to pay attention to. The other things that they ask us to pay attention to is how spatial or scalar terms such as global and local and national and regional play out and create for us particular kinds of imaginations and particular kinds of limitations, whereas what these scholars are trying to do is break some of these binaries and allow us to think of the world as relational rather than as something that is, in two different binary or opposing spatial unrelated places. So this is very important, this, the breaking of the binary of here, there, us, them, near, far. Of course, in a distant sense these exist, but the us and them have a social relation, and that is what we need to pay attention to in this course. I have up here a quote by Doreen Massey, another scholar we will be reading in this course, and she uses the term spatial imagination, and there is in fact a very interesting podcast called Spatial Delight that goes over the work of Doreen Massey for any of you who wish to pursue this further. But I'll read out this quote, and to me this is what I would like us to take away from today's lecture. She writes for spatial imagination, as the way we are and the way places are, so the way we are and the way places are is a product of our interrelationships with everywhere else, and all those geographies and those relations are full of power. She has a very significant book titled The Global Sense of Place, where she studies her hometown and shows how her hometown is constructed through various relationships with different parts of the world. So this binary between local and global is quite well dismantled in her work. I will end the lecture here, and we'll see you in the next class. Thank you.